Now, in the United States, we assume that there is an uncomplicated one-to-one relationship between one's sex and one's gender. We assume that if you have a female body, then you are a girl and eventually a woman. If you have a male body, you are, or at least ought to be, a boy and eventually a man. And as long as there's a conformity between one's sex and one's gender, we're quite content as a society to acknowledge the people that we encounter. In fact, the reason that I have to spend time in my introduction to anthropology classes distinguishing between sex and gender, creating definitions or explaining the definitions of why sex is different from gender, is precisely because in the US we fuse those categories together and we see one's gender as one's sex and one's sex as one's gender. So we pretend, or we imagine in American society, that one's sex equals one's gender equals one's sex, so that when you see somebody's social clothing, we assume we know what's happening with them biologically, or if we know what's happening with somebody biologically, we expect their social clothing, that is their gender, to be a certain way. So we assume a one-to-one, uncomplicated relationship between one's sex and one's gender. And that is very distinctive of American society. It's a hegemonic perspective of American society, but it's not universal, far from it. In India, for example, this relationship is much more complex. There is not an assumption that one's sex is indicative of one's gender, and in fact, the correlation between one's sex and one's gender is much more flexible. The common sense assumption in India is that there is a much more flexible, fluid, and complex relationship between one's sex and one's gender. So the sex is an underlying biological reality, and people are able to acknowledge or recognize what physiological, anatomical, and biological stuff is happening on the bodily level. But that doesn't mean that in India you would assume that that has a direct correlation to one's gender identity. In fact, Srinananda helps us understand that in India there's an expectation that you might actually fluctuate in terms of your gender identity. So she writes on page 376, she writes, all persons, according to Indian worldview, all persons contain within themselves both male and female principles. The supreme being is conceptualized as one complete sex, containing male and female sexual organs. Hermaphroditism is the ideal. There is a cultural flexibility that's expected within the Indian context. So because the supreme being contains both male and female within it, and because the expectation that all humans contain within them some kind of balance or equilibrium between their male principle and their female principle, and in fact between their womanhood and their manhood, the equilibrium, there's an assumption that the equilibrium will change over the course of a lifetime. So while in the United States we assume that one's gender is fixed from the moment that we're born to the day that we die, that it's one of those personhoods that's unchanging, and if somehow you don't fit into that model, you're seen as pathological, something that needs to be fixed. In the Indian context, it's quite different. In fact, in this case, maybe quite the opposite. The assumption is that your gender is not fixed, that the balance between your male and female principles, or your, those are the sex categories, or your womanhood and your manhood, the balance between them will fluctuate over the course of a lifetime, so that at some points in your life you might tend more towards being womanly, and at other moments in your life you might tend towards being more manly. And in fact, if you don't, if you're fixed from birth to death, that might seem pathological from an Indian perspective. So I like this example because it really helps us see, first of all, the separation between sex and gender, and also how your worldview shapes quite distinctly what it is that you come to experience. So if you assume that things won't change, and then there's someone who changes, then that's seen as pathological and everyone else is seen as normal. If you assume that things will change and somebody doesn't, then that individual might seem as pathological, while everyone else who's fluctuating might seem quote unquote normal.